Welcome to today's deep dive. We're really thrilled to have you with us because today we are tackling a mission that is, well, it's going to completely alter the way you process the thousands of images flashing across your screen.
Absolutely, every single day.
Right. Every single day. We are exploring a core tension that sits right at the intersection of art, economics, and philosophy. And that tension is basically this. What happens when a photograph of profound human suffering is just breathtakingly beautiful?
Yeah, it's a huge question.
Does that sheer aesthetic beauty numb you to the pain of the person inside the frame, or does it actually serve to awaken your sense of justice?
It's a dilemma that feels incredibly urgent, for anyone living in our highly visual culture. We exist in this landscape where we are bombarded by imagery every waking second. Constantly scrolling, yeah. Consuming tragedy and triumph in the exact same visual breath. So our deep dive today is about dissecting how certain, very rare photographs manage to force you to stop that endless scroll, to sort of short-circuit your expectations and actually see the other person looking back at you.
And our sources for this journey dive really deep into the portfolio of the world-renowned documentary photographer Sebastião Salgado. Specifically, we're putting a magnifying glass over his iconic, sweeping images of the Serra Pelada gold mine in Brazil.
And his deeply haunting photographs of refugees in Rwanda.
Exactly. We are going to navigate the incredibly complex ethics of capturing suffering, the heavy criticisms leveled against this kind of fine art, and ultimately the philosophical defense of beauty itself.
Okay, let's unpack this.
To really grasp the gravity of Salgado's portfolio, we have to ground ourselves in the historical context of the Serra Pelada gold mine. We are looking at the Brazilian gold rush of the 1980s.
During this era, Brazil was buckling under the weight of a massive debt-ridden economy. And running parallel to that macroeconomic crisis was widespread, systemic landlessness among the peasant class.
And our sources closely link this rural displacement to the Movimento Sem Terra, or the MST, right?
Spot on. Because these agricultural workers were completely stripped of their land and their livelihoods, you had over 250,000 impoverished peasants flocking to these newly discovered mines. It wasn't a pursuit of luxury. It was absolute raw survival.
250,000 people descending on one geographic location out of sheer desperation is almost unimaginable, and the environmental cost of that desperation was devastating.
Yeah, the landscape was never the same.
The historical record shows that the sheer frenzy of extracting this wealth meant nature was essentially ransacked. Rivers throughout the entire region were heavily poisoned by massive quantities of mercury used in the extraction process. The local vegetation, the animal life, the very topography of the land was decimated. It was a dual sacrifice, really both ecological and human.
And into that chaotic, tragic reality steps Salgado with his camera. He wasn't just snapping quick journalistic updates for the evening news. He was documenting an epic of modern labor.
The visuals he captured in that pit are permanently etched into the minds of anyone who has seen them. He shot these scenes in a sweeping, majestic black and white format. When you look at the wide shots of the mine, they reveal what the analysis calls the curious geometry of the anonymous.
That's a great phrase.
It really is. You are looking at a vast, terrifying crater in the earth, and clinging to the sides are thousands upon thousands of human beings, caked in dirt, climbing these incredibly precarious wooden ladders up sheer cliff faces.
Carrying heavy sacks of earth.
Yeah, they are harnessed to this endless, grueling productivity, looking for all the world like worker ants. It is a towering visual epic of capitalist exploitation.
But the narrative doesn't just leave you hovering above that wide, impersonal view. The lens zooms in, and that is where the psychological confrontation happens.
Oh, definitely. There is one specific image from this collection that is just completely arresting. It is a tight, close-up portrait of a single garimpero, a miner. He's completely enveloped in this thick, wet mud. It coats his hair, his torso, his face.
He looks like a statue.
He does. It renders him almost subhuman, as if he is physically made of the very earth he is being forced to excavate. The mud is literally streaming down his features. But the detail that stops your heart is his expression. He is looking directly into the camera lens, and he has this defiant, incredibly cryptic smile. He's not a passive victim in that moment. He is a fully realized human challenging the viewer.
What's fascinating here is the psychological tension that specific image creates for you, the viewer. I want you to imagine for a second that you are standing in a pristine, minimalist, elite art gallery in a wealthy Western metropolis.
Okay, setting the scene.
You might be holding a $7 latte. The room is quiet and climate-controlled. You look up, and you lock eyes with this muddy miner on the gallery wall. The dissonance between the grimy, brutal reality of his lived experience and the high-art, sterilized setting where you are consuming his image is immense. It forces a very uncomfortable confrontation.
Which brings us right to the elephant in the room and the second major theme we need to navigate, the ethical problem of beautiful suffering. There is a glaring market contradiction baked into this entire enterprise.
Oh, absolutely.
These photographs are inherently criticizing capitalist exploitation. They are showing the brutal, physical, human cost of extracting wealth from the earth. Yet these very same photos are printed on high-quality archival paper, framed beautifully, and sold as fine art in the exact same capitalist markets they're critiquing.
Yeah, the language of wealth and the language of ethics have become deeply, almost inseparably entangled. The author of the research is making a very sharp, inherently political critique of global capitalism here. And while our goal today isn't to take a side or endorse that specific politics, we absolutely have to examine this argument to understand why Salgado's art and documentary photography in general is so controversial in the gallery space.
Right, because the critique suggests that turning poverty into a luxury commodity is an ethical paradox.
Exactly. To ground that ethical paradox in a comparative example, the analysis brings up one of the most famous photographs of the 20th century, Steve McCurry's portrait of the Afghan girl Sharbat Gula.
Oh, almost everyone listening knows this photo. The young, striking girl with the dazzling, piercing green eyes wrapped in a red shawl, staring out from the cover of National Geographic.
That image became a global icon. It made the photographer Steve McCurry incredibly famous, cementing his legacy and bringing him immense financial success. But the reality of the subject is starkly different. Sharbat Gula herself remained an anonymous refugee living in severe poverty for decades after that shutter clicked.
And while McCurry later showed generosity by helping to pay for her children's schooling once she was finally tracked down years later, the fundamental imbalance remains, doesn't it?
It does. She didn't own the rights to her own face, let alone the profits generated by it. The core question posed here is piercing. Has anyone actually asked Sharbat Gula her opinion on becoming a global symbol?
Wow. It's a gut punch of a question regarding consent, agency, and who truly reaps the benefits of captured trauma. This dynamic is exactly why Salgado's sweeping, beautiful images of the global south have faced some incredibly heavy-hitting critics.
They really have.
The French art historian Jean-François Chevrier pulls no punches. He straight up accuses Salgado of engaging in sentimental voyeurism. Chevrier's argument is that by highly stylizing these photos, the artist inadvertently makes the photographer the hero of the story, transforming the subject's misery into a showcase for the artist's own compositional genius.
And adding to that chorus is the legendary cultural critic Susan Sontag. Her critique operates on a different but equally sharp frequency. Sontag argues that by globalizing and aestheticizing suffering on such a massive, epic scale, Salgado's work inadvertently makes viewers feel like the problem is just too vast and historical to ever fix.
It makes it feel inevitable.
Precisely. When faced with such monumental, beautifully rendered misery, the viewer's compassion can only flounder and become an abstract feeling. In her view, this epic scale paralyzes us rather than mobilizing us.
I have to admit, when I first read Susan Sontag's critique, it stung. It is a really uncomfortable mirror to look into. It's hard to hear that making a tragedy look epic or biblical might actually give us a psychological excuse not to help because it frames the suffering as an eternal human condition rather than a solvable political problem.
It's a tough pill to swallow.
And then you add Latin American academic Raul Antello to the mix, who heavily criticizes the elitism of the artistic procedures themselves. Antello points out that these images of grassroots poverty are produced, distributed, and exhibited in a way that aligns them entirely with high-end art markets, rather than the grassroots political movements they are supposedly championing.
These critiques are formidable. They force a necessary reckoning with the very nature of documentary photography. You have to ask, are these photographers truly bearing witness to injustice, or are they extracting human misery to build a beautiful, lucrative portfolio?
So what does this all mean? How does the analysis defend against that? Does it just dismiss Salgado's work as fundamentally unethical and walk away?
Far from it. The research mounts a really rigorous, multi-layered defense of this kind of photography. And that defense begins by deconstructing this concept of the gaze. A lot of the criticism we just discussed assumes that the gaze is purely a one-way street. A powerful, wealthy Westerner looking down through a lens at a powerless, passive victim.
Like looking at an insect under a microscope. It implies total dominance by the observer.
But scholars Lutz and Collins offer a fascinating counter-theory. They argue that a photograph is never just a one-way mirror. An image actually contains an intersection of up to 7 different gazes.
7.
Yeah, you have the photographer's gaze, the editor's gaze who selected the image, the viewer's gaze, the gaze of the people in the background, and so on. But they argue that the most powerful disruptive gaze of all is when the non-Western subject looks back.
Which brings us right back to our muddy miner from Sarah Pallotta locking eyes with us from the gallery wall.
Exactly. Lutz and Collins call this the refracted gaze. When the subject looks directly back at you through the camera lens, it short-circuits that exact sentimental voyeurism Chevrier warned about. The subject refuses to be just a passive victim being observed from afar. That direct eye contact turns the image from a static statement about poverty into a direct, urgent question posed to you, the listener. It demands that you acknowledge them as an equal, sentient human being who is fully aware they're being looked at.
And that concept leads right into the defense of the aesthetics themselves. Why the sources argue these photos actually must be beautiful. In our modern, hyper-connected world, we are all suffering from massive image fatigue.
Oh, big time.
We are completely numb to the endless 24-hour cycle of tragic news clips, disaster footage, and smartphone videos of suffering. The analysis refers to these fleeting, easily forgotten images as simulacra. If Salgado just took a standard, gritty, pixelated news snapshot of the gold mine, we would swipe past it in a fraction of a second and forget it entirely.
This is where the aesthetic choices do the heavy ethical lifting. The argument is that Salgado purposefully uses classical, almost painterly art techniques to rescue the aura of the image from the noise of the news cycle. He employs the majestic sweep of black and white film. He uses chiaroscuro, that dramatic, theatrical interplay of deep shadows and bright highlights you might see in a Caravaggio painting, and he uses sfumato.
And for those who might not be familiar with art history terms, sfumato is that technique where tones and colors shade gradually into one another. Think of the Mona Lisa, that soft, hazy blending around her eyes and smile that makes her look almost glowing and divine. Salgado is taking a technique historically reserved for Renaissance royalty and applying it to nameless, impoverished miners. It is a radical elevation of the subject.
The beauty acts as a deliberate trap. It forces your scrolling thumb to stop. By making the image undeniably, classically beautiful, he lifts the subject out of the transient, disposable news cycle and elevates them into a transcendent, undeniable human being. You're captivated by the lighting, and before you know it, you are locked into a confrontation with the subject's humanity. You simply can't look away.
Let's look at how that transcendent beauty is used to convey an unimaginable historical tragedy. The sources shift our focus from Brazil to Rwanda in 1994. The text describes a deeply haunting photograph of Rwandan refugees moving through Tanzania.
And what is crucial to note about this specific image is what is not included in the frame.
It's 1994, the height of the genocide. But instead of showing explicit bloodshed, graphic violence, or the horrific aftermath we usually associate with that event, Salgado shows us these hazy, dark silhouettes of people snaking their way along a riverbank. The figures are entirely shrouded in a thick mist and the soft early morning light. It is described as a beautiful, almost biblical allegory of displacement and profound despair.
Now remember Susan Sontag's earlier critique. She argued that when subjects are unnamed and unidentifiable, they lose their specific political power and become abstract. But the analysis uses this Rwandan image to argue the exact opposite.
Really? How so?
Well, because the figures are hazy silhouettes wrapped in the mist, because they are uncanny and nameless, it actually forces the viewer to grapple with humanity in general, rather than isolating the suffering to one specific, distant demographic that is easy to write off as other.
It makes the theme of displacement universal. You look at those silhouettes and realize it could be anyone in any era fleeing their home.
To understand the philosophical weight of this, we need to bring in Emmanuel Levinas. Levinas was a philosopher who wrote extensively about what he called the face-to-face encounter. His core philosophy argues that when we truly deeply encounter the other, someone fundamentally different from us, a stranger, it sparks a profound ethical demand within us. Our responsibility to our fellow human begins the moment we recognize their face.
The metaphor used to describe this ethical awakening is incredibly poignant. The analysis compares this realization of our responsibility to the other person to an ember. Not a roaring, uncontrollable fire, but a glowing coal.
It is fragile, it is precarious, an ember flickers between light and darkness. When you look at that beautiful, haunting image of the Rwandan refugees in the mist or the muddy miner looking back at you, it sparks that ember of ethical possibility inside you.
But an ember requires oxygen.
Exactly. It requires tending. If you don't actively nurture that ethical response, if you just feel a momentary twinge of sadness in the gallery and then go back to your latte, the ember goes cold.
Here's where it gets really interesting and incredibly counterintuitive. The analysis argues that the primary emotion we usually rely on to tend that ember is actually the completely wrong approach. I'm talking about compassion. The sources make the striking argument that compassion is not what we should be aiming to feel when looking at these photos.
It sounds shocking at first glance. We are raised to believe compassion is the highest moral response to suffering. But scholar James Johnson, building on the foundational work of political theorist Hannah Arendt, breaks down why compassion is a trap. Johnson argues that compassion is fundamentally about trying to literally feel the other person's pain. And while that sounds noble, it can actually paralyze real structural political action.
We see this exact phenomenon today with modern social media activism. You see a tragic video on your feed, you feel a wave of intense pity, you hit like or share to express your compassion, and then your brain gives you permission to keep scrolling. You feel an emotional catharsis, like you've done something meaningful, but absolutely nothing actually changed for the person in the video. That is exactly the trap Johnson is warning us about. Compassion makes the viewing experience about our feelings rather than their need for justice.
Salgado doesn't want to harvest your pity. He is aiming for solidarity. And he uses a very specific structural representational strategy across his photo essays to achieve this. If you look at the mechanics of his books, like the ones featuring Sarah Pallotta, he consistently juxtaposes these striking, intense individual portraits like our muddy miner with those massive, sweeping, collective shots of the entire mountain of workers.
That structural framing is entirely intentional. It prompts you, the viewer, to connect the acute suffering of the individual looking right at you to the massive, systemic collectives they belong to. It links the plight of the single garimpero to the sprawling global supply chains of capitalism.
The aesthetic beauty of the photograph captures your sentient emotion. It hooks your feelings and forces you to stop. But the macro structure of the photo essay, continually zooming in on the human and zooming out of the system, forces your cognitive brain to engage. It forces you to look at the gold that the miner is digging up and ask the hard, systemic questions. How am I implicated in this? Am I wearing that gold? Are the electronics I use daily benefiting from this exact system of extraction?
It forcibly moves you from an internal, passive feeling of pity to an external, active question of political reality. It is a brilliant, challenging way to reframe how we consume media. So, as we bring the threads of this deep dive together, let's summarize the journey we've taken. We've seen that a truly great documentary photograph isn't a simple answer. It isn't just a static historical document recording a fact for the archive.
This is an active question.
Yes. Salgado uses the visual language of classical beauty not to hide or sanitize the suffering of the miners in Brazil or the refugees in Rwanda, but to force us to confront it. He weaponizes beauty to shake us out of our postmodern numbness, hoping that the fragile ember of ethics can catch fire and evolve from fleeting compassion into real systemic solidarity.
And that stands as the ultimate takeaway for you listening. The next time you are on your phone and you find yourself scrolling past a striking image of hardship, tragedy, or displacement on your feed, take a deliberate pause. Notice who is looking at whom. Are you just passively consuming their image for a quick, self-serving hit of empathy? Or are you willing to pause, hold their gaze, and actually answer the question their eyes are asking you?
It's a powerful challenge to our daily habits. And it leaves us with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over, building on everything the sources have shown us today. If a masterfully composed photograph captures an ember of ethical possibility in a single, frozen moment, what happens to the human subject years or even decades later?
That's the part that really haunts you.
When the photographer packs up their gear and leaves, when the gallery exhibition closes its doors, and when you, the viewer, move on to the next beautiful image, the subject remains permanently trapped in that silver-toned moment of their past suffering. Are we, as modern consumers of high art and media, ultimately demanding that someone else's trauma remain permanently beautiful just so we can occasionally practice our own empathy?
That is a profound question that lingers long after the image itself is gone.
Keep looking closely at the world around you, and we'll catch you next time.